The Metroid franchise has always been considered one of the darker and more disturbing series among Nintendo's mainstays. At most, however, the games would often tease and dabble in horror elements, without ever passing the threshold for what makes a game genuinely haunting. That was the case until the release of Metroid Fusion. But what was it about this game in particular that forced me and many others back in the day to stop playing and come back to it later? What elements allowed Metroid Fusion to build this unease, and ultimately create an experience that would haunt players until well after the credits? Today, we'll look to discuss how Metroid Fusion forced the player to feel fear. Following on from the original trilogy, Samus finds herself up to her usual shenanigans, exploring the surface of planet SR-388 with a survey crew from biological space laboratories. There, they encounter an unknown species of parasite, later known as the X-Parasite. This parasite attacks and infects Samus' central nervous system, causing her to crash when returning to the BSL station. Imagine if the game ended there. Now that would be truly horrifying. But instead, Samus is recovered by the BSL ship and escorted back for medical treatment. There, they discover that the only method to save her is to use a vaccine containing the cells from an infant Metroid, the natural predator of the X-Parasite. Now, after regaining consciousness, Samus learns that an explosion occurred at the BSL station, where her suit had been sent for analysis. Samus, as usual, is tasked with investigating this explosion, and this is where we get our first glimpse of dread. Samus herself mentions that a part of her feels a sense of fear. Now let me remind you that this is coming from a badass bounty hunter that has continuously hunted alien lifeforms for her whole life. Watching our usual stoic hero express genuine fear builds anticipation and unease in the player's mind about what could possibly be happening over at the station. Now the mission itself is overseen by a new gunship's computer, which she chooses to nickname Adam after her former commanding officer. Now I don't know about you guys, but this has always rubbed me the wrong way. Instead of a warm respite that helps Samus throughout the game, listening to this AI communicate with her and knowing that it's supposed to be Adam makes you realize more now than ever just how alone you truly are. Small mentions are also made regarding the X-Parasite's ability to replicate their host's physical appearance, which is ominous and makes the player wonder indefinitely what this could possibly mean. Now the first thing you'll probably notice is the lack of power-ups and weapons. The game does a good job of letting you know that you're weak as shit, saying you're only at 10% battle capacity. This adds a sense of vulnerability not usually seen in Metroid. Samus, who over the games has built up her arsenal to be truly impressive, is essentially back at square one. One of the most effective parts of Fusion's ability to induce unease and fear is the stellar soundtrack attached to the game. Now, is it grand and emotional? Not really. Does it make use of sudden spikes in sounds to create shock instances like in other horror games? No. If anything, it's the exact opposite. The game employs heavy use of ominous low drone sounds with a focus on the use of dissonance. The result is a truly unnerving experience. God, even just listening to the elevator used to make me sick to my stomach as a kid. The music, which was composed by Minako Hamano and Akira Fujiwara, were tasked by Sakamoto to create a soundtrack in accordance with Adam's dialogue. They aimed for a serious ambient music rather than melody, which proved to be extremely effective in portraying the world as both empty and mysterious. But it's what the game does in conjunction with the soundtrack that is especially great. After listening to this panic-inducing soundtrack for the good part of the introductory sequences, and following Samus taking the elevator down into Sector 1, the background ambience abruptly stops. This is followed by one of the most haunting introductions to an enemy ever seen in the franchise, accompanied by loaded footsteps that echo throughout the station. We get our first look at the game's main enemy, the SAX. And when I say we get a look, I mean we get a very good look, as the game makes it a point to zoom in on the cold, lifeless white eyes of this infected Samus. It was at this point that I threw down my Game Boy. I didn't play it for the next few days. And I'm not kidding. But why is this scene so effective though? The idea that an enemy has just been introduced, but you don't have to face it straight away, builds tension and unease. Just knowing that this thing is strolling around and could be around the corner at any point leaves you in a constant state of terror. Not only that, but it's you. It's Samus, or at least it appears to be. It gets you thinking in overdrive, and that's when you realize and think back to that initial point made at the start of the game. The fact that the X-Parasites can replicate their host's physical appearance. Now that is how you build atmosphere and fear, and to this day is probably one of the best examples of it, and from a game that isn't uniquely considered a horror game.
Wait a minute!
Now I would have loved if the encounters with the SAX were actually random. where it just strolls around and you'd hear its footsteps every now and then. But unfortunately, all the encounters with the SAX are predetermined. The player is unaware of this, however, during their first playthrough, and the encounters themselves are crafted perfectly. Throughout the game, with each encounter, what you'll notice is that you have nowhere near enough power to take it out. That means you're forced to hide, run, and avoid it at all costs. Another method Sakamoto used to build tension. Ever notice how the SAX will first freeze Samus with the ice beam before blasting her with missiles? The exact same method you used previously against Metroids. I always thought this was a nice touch that added so much to the whole switcheroo experience. Now while the SAX is haunting in its own right, that isn't to say the rest of the enemies aren't just as terrifying. From ghouls to mechanical spiders and everything else in between, the game does not shy away from using nightmarish designs to instill dread within the player. I think some of you might have just picked up on the hint I just dropped. But when first leaving Sector 5, Samus enters a room filled with glass panels. In this section, a large entity's shadow can be seen moving around in the background, followed by a low drone sound. This is ominous, but the real horror starts once you're forced back to that same location, only to find the glass panels have been completely shattered by an explosion, meaning that whatever was being contained behind that glass was now free. Scrambling through the rest of the Arctic sector, you find yourself in the electronic junkyard. Again, the game perfectly builds up to the introduction of this new enemy, first by giving you a hint of his existence, but then masking under the sense of relief as you know that it's being contained behind glass. Once you realize it's broken out though, you feel the same sense of unease as you did with the SAX, unsure of when it might make its appearance. These feelings continue to culminate until you find yourself in this junkyard. At first, you believe it to be empty, until you start to slowly see the emergence of a truly horrifying monster. Oh, wait, not that one. That one is horrifying, but for all the wrong reasons. You're met with a monster fittingly named Nightmare, and while he might seem intimidating at first, it's what occurs throughout the fight that truly makes this encounter as horrifying as it is memorable. At first, Nightmare is fully clad in armor, but upon taking damage, Nightmare's hellish face reveals itself to be an organic mess, dripping and deteriorating the more damage you do. This paired with the limited space to move and the unusually slow movements where he edges closer to Samus make for a haunting encounter that I'm sure many of us still remember vividly to this day. Now one of the biggest criticisms that Fusion garners has to do with the linearity of the map and the room layouts. And while this is true when compared to other Metroid games, I think it works especially well in this game. The levels are designed to instill this idea that you're stuck alone, being hunted by yourself. The use of linear and tight rooms make the player feel like there's less likelihood of avoiding the SAX. And as I mentioned before, the first time playing, you truly do believe it's randomized. This keeps the player on edge, as you know that following a linear path will most likely result in you having to face off against the SAX again and again, with nowhere to run or hide. It truly does make for one of the most daunting atmospheres to find yourself in. The intricate sprites, outstanding original soundtrack, and nuanced sound effects truly make Metroid Fusion one of the Game Boy Advance's hallmark titles. Its unique and elaborate brand of 2D horror would inspire future games like Metroid Dread. The overall presentation is detailed enough to convey what Nintendo R&D1 team was going for on a text level, while still leaving a room for players to fill in the gaps. It's been over 20 years since the release of Metroid Fusion, and in that time, there have been few, if any, 2D games that bring out and recreate the same feeling of fear experienced in Metroid Fusion. If you guys enjoyed that video, please do consider subscribing, and I'll see you all in the next one. Ciao.